Today we'll start on a little bit of a different subject. We finished off yesterday looking at the mode of warfare. So far we have looked at, we began with looking at the counterfeit. We began looking at Fatima and the papacy in its two phases, the Alpha history and the Omega history. Then we stepped back from that with our understanding of World War I and World War II, this resurrection of the papacy. And then we began looking at Acts 27. We considered the number 273. This took us to the time of Alexander the Great and those Diadochi Wars. Just a reminder of those Diadochi Wars. Alexander the Great, he called himself Alexander the Great. I will call him Alexander. He had a fairly large idea of his own ability. He died in 323 BC. Our four generals of Daniel chapter 8 were placed in 301 BC at the Battle of Ipsus. Battle of Ipsus, 301 BC, gave us our four generals. Those generals were Lysimachus, Seleucus, Ptolemy, and Cassander. Which one of these is traditionally known as the King of the North? Seleucus. We traditionally understand Seleucus as the King of the North. But when we made our prophetic application, we understood the King of the North to be represented by Antigonus and Demetrius. We understood this history from 323 to 301 BC is the history of four Diadochi Wars. The history of those four Diadochi Wars is what the history of those dozens of Alexander's generals that tore apart his kingdom and divided it between themselves like beasts over a carcass. But out of those four Diadochi Wars, our four generals emerge. It's the third and the fourth Diadochi War where we see similar characteristics. It's in the third and the fourth Diadochi War where we see our four generals, Lysimachus, Seleucus, Ptolemy, and Cassander, all unite against one common enemy, Demetrius, mainly his father Antigonus. Antigonus and Demetrius. We understand in the fourth, Pyrrhus enters the scene, and we picked up that story with the fourth Diadochi War. I just want to remind us of that history. Because I want to introduce a little bit of the third Diadochi War now to teach us a different point. So in the third and the fourth you have this same dynamic, but this is as some of these generals come to power. They aren't necessarily all in power at that point in time. Not all established. But most of the other generals have either fled or been killed at this point in time. Between the third and fourth Diadochi War, there was a period of peace. The third Diadochi War ended in 311 BC. The fourth, as we have already discussed, 307 BC. This is the history of the third. Diadochi War. As we said, our 4 generals against Antigonus and Demetrius. But as we see, there's regularly 4 generals, but what we regularly see is it's only 3 that have come into the alliance and actually face him. Those 3 allies against Antigonus and Demetrius. So this Third Diadochi War, those 4 generals are equal in strength to Antigonus and Demetrius. So those 4 combined still are only equal, and they're unable to defeat him. So what they do is they sign a peace treaty in 311. It's the peace of the dynasts. This is kind of like a ceasefire. The war isn't over, they still want to defeat each other, but neither side is strong enough to take out the other side. What happened in 311, just prior to 311 BC, or actually I'll go back to the beginning of the Third Diadochi War, is that there was a conflict particularly between Antigonus and another officer, another general. When Antigonus defeated that general, he became very powerful. And this is what began the Third Diadochi War. When Antigonus became so powerful, he started pressuring the other generals to give up their territory. And one of those generals that he forced out of his territory was Seleucus. Seleucus was forced by Antigonus to give up Babylon. Because we know that Seleucus' territory consisted of Babylon, and then he expanded from Babylon. That began the Third Diadochi War. When Seleucus was forced to give up Babylon, he fled knowing his life was in danger to Ptolemy, and persuaded Ptolemy to go into alliance with Lysimachus and Cassander to take on Antigonus. So it's this conflict over Babylon that began the Third Diadochi War. So what happens when this peace treaty is signed is it frees up Antigonus and Seleucus to now go to war. This peace of the dynasts, as it was known, was Lysimachus, Cassander, and Ptolemy signing peace. Lysimachus, Cassander, and Ptolemy signed here peace with Antigonus and his son Demetrius. But this peace treaty was not between Antigonus and Seleucus. Seleucus never signed it, because now in 311 BC is when they go to war. And this was the war over Babylon. Seleucus was now strong enough to try to take back Babylon. So between 311 BC and 309 BC is the Babylonian War. And this is what began the Seleucid Empire. The Babylonian War was a series of battles between 311 and 309 BC, fought between Antigonus and Seleucus over control in Mesopotamia and Babylon. The final outcome in 309 BC saw Seleucus victorious and allowed him to establish the Seleucid Empire. So when we talk about Seleucus versus Ptolemy, that empire that was the king of the north began in 309 BC. This is the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus was able to retake Babylon. What he did was he had his army creep up on the army of Antigonus and attack them in the early hours of the morning while it was yet dark and they were unexpected. And Antigonus gives up Babylon and flees. So when he retakes Babylon in 309 BC, it marks the beginning of the Seleucid Empire. And then we know that they go back to battle in 307 BC. And what was 307 BC when we made application? The time of the end. You could also understand it as World War II. beginning, yes. So 311 BC, peace of the dynasts. Then the Seleucid Empire is established after this Babylonian War. So 3rd Diadochi War, Babylonian War, 4th Diadochi War. And this began the 4th Diadochi War. And this is where we began to make application into World War II, into that history. So do we see a war that has very similar characteristics to World War II beginning before that time? The 3rd and the 4th Diadochi War were one war with a peace treaty in the middle to allow them to regroup. Do we have that same characteristic? Do we have a war between World War II that saw the same powers come to fight? When we considered 307 BC, it brought us to 1939. And this is the beginning of World War II. It can also be understood as the time of the end. When did World War I formally end? What's the formal end of World War I? It ended with an armistice in 1918, but an armistice is not the end of a war. It's the same way we can still consider North Korea and South Korea to be at war. They've signed a peace treaty, they're no longer fighting, but it's also not the end of the war. The World War I formally ended with the Treaty of Versailles, which was June 28, 1919. The Treaty of Versailles. And this was the formal end of World War I. Quoting from America's Library, a government website, June 28, 1919 was the Treaty of Versailles, and World War I was finally over. This first global conflict had claimed from 9 million to 13 million lives and caused unprecedented damage. Germany had formally surrendered on November 11 of 1918, and all nations had agreed to stop fighting while the terms of peace were negotiated. On June 28 of 1919, Germany and the Allied nations, including Britain, France, Italy and Russia, signed the Treaty of Versailles, formally ending World War I. At least ostensibly, World War I ended first with the cessation of armed hostilities between the warring powers at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, that is, November 11, 1918. The official or diplomatic end of World War I came later at the Treaty of Versailles, June 28, 1919. This takes us back to our study of the counterfeit. 309 BC for Seleucus is when he receives his seat. And we know, what must the papacy receive? Power, seat, and great authority. What we're looking at today is when the papacy receives his seat. 1919, that treaty freed up the papacy. In May, just the month before the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the Secretary of State for Ecclesiastical Affairs discussed what was known as the Roman Question with the Italian Premier. This was the Roman Question. The Roman Question was what to do about the papacy Now that the Italian state had unified, where could it be established? The Secretary of State for the papacy discussed this Roman question with the Italian Premier Vittorio Orlando in May of 1919 and presented to him a solution composed by Cardinal Gaspari that would have attributed to the enclosed Vatican the character of a sovereign state. This is the first time that they propose this beginning of the Lateran Treaty. What this is Cardinal Gaspari beginning to work on the Roman question, beginning to work on the Italian state to provide the Vatican with a seat. Cardinal Gaspari worked pretty much as the boss, directing the work of two men. The first, both brothers, Pacelli brothers, Eugenio, who became Pope Pius XII, and that other brother, Francesco, who, with Cardinal Gaspari, wrote the Lateran Treaty. So this man is behind both the Lateran Treaty and that Code of Canon Law that was written in 1917 and taken to Germany. And it's in 1919 that he begins work on introducing some type of establishment for establishing of the papacy in Italy. This led from May to June to a projected concordat. This led to the idea of an agreement between the government and the Catholic Church in Italy. But when the war ended, the government changed, and that changed these discussions. In 1919, Italian Catholics founded the Popular Party of Italy. This is the Catholic Party under Italy. And it was set in Parliament. It does not seem to be impossible to find a point of agreement which brings together the teachings of the papacy concerning complete independence with the domestic and international needs of the Italian state. So what they're acknowledging, this statement in 1921, is that they think that it is possible to come to an agreement where they can satisfy the needs of the papacy for total independence from the state, with also the needs of the Italian state. And it's from 1919 that this proposal begins to be debated in the Italian Parliament. We understand that it's brought about in 1929. And this is the Lateran Treaty. So 311, 309, 307 BC. This is the midpoint. 311 to 309 is 2 years. 309 to 307, 2 years. Then we come down here and we have two phases of the one war. In the middle of these two phases, you see 10 years, 1919 to 1929, 1929 to 1939. In the midpoint, the papacy received its seat. It received those Vatican lands, total independence from the state. It now has a seat in Italy. So 307 BC is the time of the end in our study of the Diadochi War. And it lines up with 1939. And what do both of those dates line up with? The time of the end, 1989. And I would suggest the beginning of World War III. When do we see a change in scene in this war? We understood we can place this war in 1945, the beginning of the Third World War III, under the Cold War. So over here, you have already this history of war between the same powers, the same, the USSR under the leadership of Russia against the United States. And when does that war change in appearance? I would suggest in 1979. This is when it turns from a Cold War to a proxy war. The change in appearance. The beginning of the Afghanistan War. When we consider, and we have for a long time considered, the Lateran Treaty as the seat for the papacy at the end of the world. But what we've been considering is that the history of the papacy comes in two phases. And we cut that in the middle and understand that it is the Alpha and the Omega. The history of the papacy, just like we understand Millerite and 144,000. So, this Alpha history, they were working with Germany in World War II to take down the King of the South. And in this Omega history, this is the papacy, the Vatican, is now working with the USA to take down the King of the South, and it's World War III. So in this Alpha history, where does the seat need to be placed? It needs to be placed in the old world, in Europe. Because this is about the old world. This is about Europe. Germany combined with Italy taking on the Soviet Union. This is all about Europe and the old world. So it makes sense that they have a seat in the old world. This is the seat for the Alpha history. But when we come into the Omega history, is that seat going to do them any good? I would suggest it does not. When we bring it down to our time and see a new time of the end, and we see this war change in appearance from the Cold War to this proxy war in Afghanistan, the midpoint takes us to 1984. This is a 5-year history, and this is the midpoint. What happened in 1984 between the United States and the papacy? January 16, 1984. This is an article from the New York Times. The United States and the Vatican established full diplomatic relations today for the first time in 117 years. The step announced here and at the Vatican this morning was described by spokesmen for the Reagan administration as intended to improve communications at a time when Pope John Paul II has become increasingly involved in international affairs. So what happened in 1984 is that there was a diplomatic relationship begun between the government of the United States and the papacy. Prior to this time, they had never had an embassy at the papacy, at the Vatican. The Vatican had never been able to send an ambassador to the United States. If they did have someone working as an ambassador, they were not paid by the state government because the United States recognized that would violate the coming together of church and state. This beginning of a diplomatic relationship in 1984 touched off strong criticism among Protestant groups, as well as some Jewish and civil liberties groups who criticized the move as a violation of the separation of church and state. The Roman Catholic reaction itself was restrained and cautious, knowing how controversial this step was. Senator Hollings, a Democrat of South Carolina and a candidate for his party's presidential nomination, said he would oppose elevating the representative of the Vatican to the position of an ambassador. He said it's in violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution and sets a bad precedent. Both Larry Speakes, the White House spokesman, and John Hughes, the State Department spokesman, said there was no violation of the separation of church and state because the United States was recognizing the Holy See rather than the Roman Catholic Church itself. So what is their excuse for beginning this diplomatic relationship? What they are saying is that the papacy, the Vatican here, is now a state power. It's a state power because of the Lateran Treaty. And you can have a relationship between a state power and a state power without saying it's church and state. He says the United States holds Pope John Paul II in high esteem. We respect the great moral and political influence which he and the Vatican exercise throughout the world. We admire the courageous stance he takes in defense of Western values. The United States of America and the Holy See, in the desire to further promote the existing mutual friendly relations, have decided by common agreement to establish diplomatic relations between them at the level of embassy on the part of the United States of America and a nunciature on the part of the Holy See, as of today, January 10, 1984. So from 1984, what does the papacy have in the United States? It has an embassy. Is an embassy a seat? This is the seat in the New World. So if we understand the papacy at the end of the world, it comes in two histories, Alpha and Omega. There is a seat for that first phase when they're trying to work with fascist Europe and under Germany. But if they're going to work with the United States, they receive a seat in 1984. There's just a couple of things this morning that I just wanted to set in place as we go on the rest of the day. That was one of them, understanding the seat. And you'll see why as we continue with our studies this afternoon. Why we just need a couple of these things in place. The other thing that I wanted to put into place was the year 2014. How we understand the year 2014 in time. I'll do that higher. Now that we've considered the seat, I want us to consider the year 2014. We understand that 2014 was the first waymark that was predicted in this movement, predicted by understanding time. And what took us to 2014 was an understanding of the 126. And this was Sunday law for us. How do we understand 2014 in the Millerite time period? What's 2014 for the Millerites? What's their Sunday law? Okay, I'll cut this off for a second and we'll just look at the time period of the Millerites. So I understand October 22, 1844 was their close of probation. Prior to that, there was the Exeter camp meeting, which was their loud cry. Prior to that, July 21st, that's midnight. Why is it understood as midnight? Midway. It comes from the parable of the 10 virgins when they wake up and that cry begins. But it's understood as midnight because it is midway. Midway between when? The first disappointment of April 19. April, May, June, July, August, September, October. This is midway. Then when we consider July 21st, then becomes 2014. So 2014 is what? Midway or midnight. So when we say we have a PBM, prediction before midnight, it's our prediction before our close of probation. Our midnight was 2014. And 2014 is symbolically, not literally, but symbolically midway then between what waymarks? 9/11, 2019. 2019 is our October 22, and 9/11 is our April 19. How 2014 was predicted in 2012 was by going backwards and understanding the 126, that there was a 1260 from 538 to 1798, that period of scattering, and now we understand there is a 126 that took us back to 1888. And the message of Jones and Wagner. A 126 was placed from 1888 to 2014. At the same time we see a 126, it was already recognised that you could also place a 151. A 151, another way of reckoning the 2520. That takes you to 1863. And this is a 151. Another date that we've been reckoning with is a 220 restoration. And we understand that can take you back to when? 1794. The 220, which is restoration. We also understand you can place a 490. It takes you back to 1524, using these prophetic numbers now as symbols. 1524 with a 490, taking you to 2014. But 2014 is midway between April 19 and October 22. So if we go back to 1888, 1863, 1794, 1524, what should these then be? These should be midway. You should be able to identify a 9/11 and a close of probation. Making 1888 midway, 1863, 1794, and 1524. Okay. When we consider 1888, (1844) was a close of probation, but something else important happened in 1844. This is Ellen White's first vision. Ellen White's first vision in 1844? When is her last vision? Her last open vision? 1884. 40 years later. (1884), Ellen White's last open vision in Portland, Oregon. Where was her first open vision? Portland, Maine. Sorry, that was... (1844), Portland, Maine. Her last, 40 years later, Portland, Oregon. Both Portland. In 1884, she makes a couple of interesting statements that I'd like us to read. Those who engaged in proclaiming the third angel's message are searching the scriptures upon the same plan that Father Miller adopted. So in 1884, there's people studying giving the third angel's message the same way, that under the same plan, the same rules that William Miller had used. In the book entitled Views of the Prophecies and Prophetic Chronology, Father Miller gives the following simple but intelligent and important rules for Bible study and interpretation. It's in 1884 that Ellen White gives her seal of approval to the rules of William Miller. And she says that in 1844, which you can understand at 9/11, she says there are people already studying the third angel's message, like William Miller did. And who are those people? Who is she referring to? Who's studying like William Miller did the message of the third angel? Jones and Wagner. And then she goes on to list the first 5 of William Miller's rules. She says, above is a portion of these rules, and in our study of the Bible we shall all do well to heed the principles set forth in these rules. She says, let everyone who claims to believe that the Lord is soon coming search the scriptures as never before, for Satan is determined to try every device possible to keep souls in darkness and blind the mind to the perils of the times in which we are living. Let every believer take up his Bible with earnest prayer, that he may be enlightened by the Holy Spirit as to what is truth, that he may know more of God and of Jesus Christ whom he has sent. Search for the truth as for hidden treasures, and disappoint the enemy. The time of test is just upon us. When is the time of test? Just upon us. For the loud cry of the third angel has already begun in the revelation of the righteousness of Christ, the sin-pardoning Redeemer. When did the loud cry begin? At the beginning of the message. This is the beginning of the light of the angel, whose glory shall fill the whole earth. For it is the work of everyone to whom the message of warning has come, to lift up Jesus, to present him to the world as revealed how? In types, shadowed in symbols, manifested in the revelations of the prophets, as unveiled in the lessons given to his disciples, and in the wonderful miracles wrought for the sons of men. Search the scriptures, for they are they that testify of him. She says there are those already studying the third angel's message like William Miller. And how are they studying it? As in types and symbols and revelations of the prophets. That last statement, I'm sorry, was 1892. I skipped my next waymark. So here they're studying the third angel's message like William Miller. And in 1892, It's in 1892 that she says the loud cry of the third angel has already begun. In 2019 has the loud cry of the third angel begun? Yes. And she's marking those that have been sharing this loud cry message, and it's in types, in symbols, and as is in Revelation, as it is in prophecy. If we go back to the 151 to 1863, what is 1863 the middle of? 1861 to 1865. And this is the American Civil War. 1863 is the midpoint of the American Civil War. In 1861, the beginning of Civil War, what does Abraham Lincoln do? Suspends habeas corpus. This is the right to a trial before being treated as if guilty. He says, "Now therefore," this is Abraham Lincoln, "be it ordered first that during the existing insurrection, and as a necessary measure for suppressing the same, all rebels and insurgents, their aiders and abettors within the United States, and all persons discouraging volunteer enlistments, resisting militia drafts, or guilty of any disloyal practice, giving aid and comfort to the rebels against the authority of the United States, shall be subject to martial law and liable to trial and punishment by court-martial or military commission." So at the beginning of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln suspends habeas corpus, a right to a trial, open to a right to a free and open trial. Additionally, Lincoln's proclamation specified whose rights would be suspended. He said, second, that habeas corpus is suspended, the right to a trial, in respect to all persons arrested or who are now or afterwards during the rebellion imprisoned in any fort, camp, arsenal, military prison, or other place of confinement by any military authority by the sentence of any court-martial or military commission. What you have is the beginning of a dictatorship. Lincoln was a dictator. And what he did during the Civil War was use habeas corpus, the expansion of habeas corpus, to also imprison any journalists who were speaking against him or against the Civil War and his own personal political enemies, as the Civil War as an excuse. 1863 is the midpoint of that Civil War. This is the Battle of Gettysburg. It was the turning point in the Civil War. And in 1865, the end of the Civil War. What happened at 9/11 that we were discussing yesterday? What did the US government bring in? This is the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act was an attack on what? On the Constitution of the United States. So at 9/11 we start to see a dictatorship form, and it's between 9/11 and 2019 that you see the government of the United States be overturned. This behaviour in US politics from 9/11 to 2019 is symbolised by civil war. It begins with the Patriot Act and it ends with Donald Trump as a dictator. As the Constitution of the United States falls. 1794. What is that in the midpoint of? 1789 to 1799. And what is that? This is the French Revolution. 1789, the beginning of the French Revolution. It's also the beginning of US government. 1789, US government begins. 1788, they ratified the Constitution. 1789, they held their very first presidential election in the United States. The beginning of the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The beginning of the French Constitution. On the 26th of August 1789, the Assembly published the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which comprised a statement of principles rather than a constitution with legal effect. The Declaration was directly influenced by Thomas Jefferson, working with General Lafayette, who introduced it. So to bring in this French Constitution required France and the United States, Thomas Jefferson and General Lafayette who introduced it. And it's the French Constitution that also inspired the US Constitution. The National Constituent Assembly functioned not only as a legislature, but also as a body to draft a new constitution in 1789. Also, the beginning of US government and constitution. After ratification, Congress set dates for the first federal elections and the official implementation of the Constitution. Elections were set to take place from Monday, 1788 to Saturday, January 10, 1789, and the new US government was set to begin on March 4, 1789. In the nation's first presidential election, George Washington was elected president and John Adams was elected vice president. Congress was also restructured to reflect the system of representation created by the Connecticut Compromise at the Constitutional Convention. So 1789, the beginning of the US government. And also this Declaration of the Rights of Man. The French Revolution took place in two halves, two phases. The first half was under these revolutionaries. This was the Jacobins. And what they inflicted was known as the Reign of Terror. They introduced the guillotine and conduct this reign of terror, killing thousands of people. 1794, the Jacobin government is toppled, and you see phase two of the French Revolution. And this is really the counterattack by those that the Jacobins were persecuting. And this is known as the White Terror. And who ends all this in 1799? Napoleon. Now, Napoleon ending the French Revolution in 1799, and what day? November 9. So 1794 again takes us to our midpoint 2014. What this gives us is that we can understand 9/11 to 2019 not only is a time period of a civil war, it's also the time period of revolution. This is a significant change in the government of the United States and the way it operates. (1524) takes you to a midpoint. 1521, and what happened in 1521? The diet of worms. Worms. This is where Luther attends the Diet of Worms. What was the Diet of Worms? It was a coming together of church and state. Do we understand that the church and state tried to come together at 9/11? The Bible passage we have for that, what scattered them? The east wind. 1524, you have the Diet of Worms, the coming together of church and state. The leaders were clinging to what? The traditions of their fathers. And this is where Luther goes into hiding. When he goes into hiding, you could say that he's tarrying. And because he is tarrying, what enters into the movement? Fanaticism. You can read all about this in chapter 8 of the Great Controversy. And Great Controversy chapter 8 and Great Controversy chapter 10, giving the history of the Diet and then also of this time period where fanaticism begins entering the Reformation. Something else you can mark in 1521 is a new Ottoman Sultan, first crowned in 1520. But in 1521 he sets on a new campaign, and this is against the West. In 1521, Solomon I attacks Belgrade. Solomon I, commonly known as Solomon the Magnificent in the West, was the 10th and longest reigning Sultan of the Ottoman Empire from 1520 until his death in 1566. Under his administration, the Ottoman state ruled over 15 to 25 million people. Solomon became a prominent monarch of the 16th century Europe, presiding over the apex of the Ottoman Empire's economic, military, and political power. Solomon personally led Ottoman armies in conquering the Christian strongholds of Belgrade in 1521 and Rhodes as well as most of Hungary before his conquests were checked at the Siege of Vienna. The fall of Christendom's major strongholds, beginning with Belgrade, spread what across Europe? Fear. As the ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire to Constantinople was to note, the capture of Belgrade was at the beginning, the origin of the dramatic events which engulfed Hungary. It led to the death of King Louis, the capture of Buda, the occupation of Transylvania, the ruin of a flourishing kingdom, and the fear of neighbouring nations that they would suffer the same fate. What does that sound like? Sounds like 9/11. 1521, Belgrade fell, and it led to the ruin of a flourishing kingdom. It was the beginning of a train of events that would lead down to the ruin of a flourishing kingdom, and all the other nations were engulfed in fear that they would suffer the same fate, that Solomon would come against them. This is distress of nations. Distress of nations we take to 9/11. What other date in Millerite history is 9/11? August 11, 1840, as well as April 19. And August 11, 1840 is the distress of nations, as they describe the fear of nations. 1524, after fanaticism enters the movement, it forces Luther out of hiding because he has to deal with this new fanaticism that has entered in his absence. In 1524, though, you begin to see controversy within the Reformation. Now it's not the opposition from the outside. In 1521, it's this combination of church and state. Now it's internal strife. Internal strife beginning in 1524, which is the midpoint of 1521. To deal with the external of the Reformation, if we consider the external, it was the Peasants' War. And this was the largest revolution experienced in Europe before the French Revolution. The German Peasants' War was a widespread popular revolt in some German-speaking areas in Central Europe from 1524 to 1525. It failed because of the intense opposition by the wealthy, who slaughtered up to 100,000 of the 300,000 poorly armed peasants and farmers. The survivors were fined and achieved few, if any, of their goals. The war consisted, like the preceding movement and the Hussite Wars, of a series of both economic and religious revolts in which peasants and farmers, often supported by Anabaptist clergy, took the lead. The German Peasants' War was Europe's largest and most widespread popular uprising prior to the French Revolution of 1789. The fighting was at its height from 1524 to the middle of 1525. What brought about this Peasants' War was the Reformation itself. When the peasants, the lower classes, started hearing the message of the Reformation, they realized that they had the same worth, the same abilities, worth in the sight of God, as did their masters. So why should they be so downtrodden? And it leads from this religious awakening into a physical revolution. It's often been seen as a precursor, this Peasants' War, as a precursor to the beginning of communism and socialism. So in 1524, you also begin to see the rise of communism. Because of this Peasants' War, the Protestant churches became more conservative and came under the total control of the elite. Luther's innate conservatism was reinforced by the revolt. He condoned the elite's domination of the new church and a theology that justified and promoted the existing social and economic system. So Luther really turned on these peasants. They were using his teaching to try and end this aristocracy, that system. So under the Peasants' War, Luther really turns on those peasants. That was the external event, this uprising. But it's also where Luther starts to argue with other leaders within the Reformation. This is Luther versus Zwingli and Erasmus. Other leaders in the Reformation who differed in views to Luther, and this created a conflict. That argument began in 1524 when Erasmus challenged Luther. The disagreement with Zwingli begins in 1525 until 1529, when they disagree as on the nature of the sacrament of the Eucharist. So what these men were introducing, Zwingli, that it's not the literal body and blood of Christ at the Catholic Mass. And what Erasmus was pushing, I believe, was the seventh-day Sabbath. Luther rejected both of what those men were trying to introduce into the Reformation. So you see conflict within the Reformation itself amongst the leadership. This is the midpoint between 1521 and 1527. 1527 was the sack of Rome. This is when Rome is sacked. 1527, Rome had been the centre of the Renaissance. Other cities had been devastated by military occupations. They were destabilised. They were experiencing poverty from internal conflict. But it was Rome that had really held together this Renaissance period of Europe. Part of this was because of the extreme wealth of the papacy. But in 1527, all of this changes. Emperor Charles V found that he could not pay his army, so he allowed them to sack Rome, to take whatever they wanted from Rome. He was greatly embarrassed by the fact that he could not stop his troops striking against the Pope and imprisoning him. So 1527 is attack on Rome and the Pope. And Pope Clement VII had to flee. Many feared at the time and since of a repeated sack of Rome. That, coupled with the Pope's virtual imprisonment after fleeing, compelled the Pope not to grant England's King Henry VIII an annulment to his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, the Emperor's aunt. In doing so, the Pope pacified Charles V. It was Charles V's army that had sacked Rome. So there's this conflict between Charles V and Henry VIII and the Pope. And because of this sack, the Pope sides with Charles V. And due to that siding, Henry VIII splits from the Catholic Church, and this begins the English Reformation. This sack of Rome marked the end of the Roman Renaissance, really the end of economic prosperity in Rome. It damaged the papacy's prestige and freed the emperor to act against the Reformation. Martin Luther commented on this event, and he said, "Christ reigns in such a way that the emperor who persecutes Luther for the Pope is forced to destroy the Pope for Luther." So the same emperor who was persecuting Luther on behalf of the Pope is now forced to destroy the Pope for Luther. The population of Rome over this sacking dropped from 55,000 before the attack to 10,000 after the attack. An estimated 6,000 to 12,000 people were slaughtered. Many imperial soldiers also died in the following months from diseases caused by the large number of unburied dead bodies in the streets. The pillage only ended when, after 8 months, the food ran out, there was no one left to ransom, and the plague began. In commemoration of the sack of Rome and the bravery of the Swiss guards that defended the Pope, the recruits to the Swiss Guard that still guard the Vatican today are sworn in on the day of the sack of Rome every year. So next year, if there's new guards for the Pope, they'll be sworn in on the 6th of May to mark the sack of Rome in 1527. Prior to 1527, Rome had been arguably the centre of that great period where art and wealth flourished. The capture of Rome and the occupation by the imperial army caused massive economic dislocation, and much of the city's wealth was spent on ransoms or stolen. Rome was devastated by the sack and its aftermath. The population of the city was felt dramatically, as we said, from 55,000 to 10,000. The city's economy was in ruins, and there was revolt in the papal estates. Following the end of the occupation of Rome, a plague decimated those 10,000 survivors. Rome was in a state of collapse, and the sack set the city back by about 100 years and ended the Renaissance. Also in 1527, persecution begins on the Anabaptists. The reason the Anabaptists were being persecuted is it was considered that back here they had been, and they were, largely behind this peasants' revolt that had been working against the aristocracy, against the wealthy. So you see persecution, the sack of Rome, the fleeing of the Pope. the end of economic prosperity for Rome. But it wasn't just Rome that persecuted the Anabaptists. They were also persecuted by their own brethren, others within the Reformation. It wasn't just Catholics, but it was all the other Protestant groups that killed the Anabaptists, that tortured and executed them to curb the growth of the movement. The Anabaptists were hated by all. The Protestants under Zwingli were the first to persecute, the first martyr falling in 1527. King Ferdinand declared drowning to be the preferred form of death of killing the Anabaptists, and many were drowned. They were judged as too radical and therefore a danger to religious stability. It was condoned by certain ancient laws which decreed the death penalty for any who practiced rebaptism. Anabaptists being named Anabaptists because they had begun to practice rebaptism as an adult. Continuing persecution in Europe was largely responsible for the mass immigrations to North America by Amish, Hutterites and Mennonites. So it's this persecution coming out of 1527 that also leads many of them to flee to the glorious land. So if we consider these four histories, these four midpoints within their own histories, we begin to see characteristics of a 9/11 and a close of probation, or 2019. We see here 9/11, we see church and state begin to come together. We see an attack on the West by this Solomon Empire, Solomon I, the Ottoman Empire, that leads to a distress of nations. We also see beginnings of change within the US government with the beginning of revolution. Changes within the Constitution. If you mark end from beginning, it's the beginning of the US government, and it starts to fall at 9/11. 1861, the beginning of also a civil war, this establishing of a dictator which is progressive. 1884, we see Ellen White say that her last open vision, this really is judgment on the church leadership. It's a church leadership that have rejected Ellen White, and now they're no longer benefited by her having open visions. Now her visions are in private, and they have to accept what she says secondhand. It's a harder test for the leadership because they failed the simpler test. And she has her last open vision. She says that there are people already studying the third angel's message after William Miller's rules, and then gives her seal of approval onto those rules. All of those things we can take to 9/11. If we mark the end of the time, we see persecution, the sack of Rome, the fleeing of the Pope, the establishment of a dictator, the end of a civil war, and Ellen White saying that the loud cry has already begun and people are understanding through types, symbols, and the opening up of the prophetic word. 2019, again, we apply those symbols. What I wanted us to particularly come away from this study with, that will hopefully benefit us, is that we can understand this time period here from 9/11 to 2019, in the Millerite time, April 19 to October 22, as a time period of civil war and a time period of revolution. Again, taking us back to our study of last night, where we need to consider what these things look like in our time period. What does a revolution look like in the 21st century, or a civil war? Because we can see that we have been in the time period of the French Revolution now for 17 years, then by 18 years. And it's the end of that. It's the end of that revolution that gives us Napoleon, or a dictator. So within the US government, within the United States, there is this overturning. Understanding this time period as the Civil War, the American Civil War and the French Revolution, really what we need to take into our next study. Those 2 points. The others are to, I guess, as proofs to establish this fact here. This time period is a time period of civil war and revolution, from the introduction of the Patriot Act to the establishment of Donald Trump as a dictator. I don't want to begin the next study until we have more time, so do you mind if we close 10 minutes early? Okay, if you'll kneel with me in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for all of our blessings and for your Sabbath day. I pray, Lord, that we will have greater clarity on these issues, that you'll flood your light upon your people, that we might be established in these truths and know where we stand in these last days, that we might be able to stand as a great and mighty army. I pray, Lord, that we will be faithful in these things. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.